I'm so happy that I was able to track you down. For people that don't know of you here in the United States, can you give us a little bit of background of who you are?
Sure thing. So, my name is Matt Hussey. I am a therapist and a journalist, not to be confused with the other Matt Hussey, who is a very successful dating coach. I have taken a very different path. So, I started out my professional career as a journalist, formerly trained in London, and I've written for magazines, newspapers, websites, pretty much everything that you put words on. And I've been doing that for a long time, 20 years. But my sort of mental health journey started in the sort of early 2010s, really. I was having a very tough time in my own life. My family had sort of collapsed. Parents went through a messy divorce in the courts, and I was really struggling to know how to deal with it all. So I started going to a therapist. Well, the first two therapists weren't great, which I can speak about if that's interesting. Found a third therapist. She was wonderful. I spent the best part of a decade with her. And while I was in that work with her, a sort of light bulb went off in my head where I realized that journalism, as it once was about people and relationships and all that sort of thing, but became less so as time went on. And I really wanted to get back to that. I wanted to spend time with people, talking to people, understanding people. So I started my training in sort of 2014, and then went through various different guises and different training schools, and sort of emerged during the COVID era, which was quite a difficult time for everybody, especially therapists. And ever since, I have a private practice in London. I see people internationally, and I write a lot about mental health, sort of corners of the mental health world that people don't speak about, sort of hidden psychology, why we do certain things, the ick, for example. And that's where you find me here today.
Okay, I love that. And I love that you brought up that you had a hard time finding the right therapist at the beginning. I do think a lot of people struggle with knowing what makes a good therapist, what doesn't. I always hear, listen, I've done a ton of therapy. I've had a lot of things happen in my life that I needed to see a therapist, and it was hard finding someone, but for different reasons, right? Because I think a terrible relationship with a therapist is someone who enables a lot of the stuff that goes on or prescribes medications just to get rid of these symptoms as opposed to delving into it. But that's from an outsider. From an insider like you, what makes a good or bad therapist?
Yeah, and it's a great question. And I think the simplest answer is it's a therapist you feel you can trust, and it's a therapist you feel you can have a kind of meaningful relationship with. I don't mean that in a romantic sense. I mean it in a relationship that can allow you to bring material that you may not felt that you could or may not feel you were allowed to. And that can be stuff about you and your story, or it can be about you and your therapist, right? Some of the best relationships I've had with therapists and clients have had with me have been about the idea of, yes, we can talk about what happens out there and we can talk about what happens back then, but can we talk about what happens in here when we work together? So for me, a good therapist is one who makes space for all three, isn't afraid of you being annoyed or upset about something they may have said. In fact, encourages it, because I think that's where the best relationships happen, when it can be feel more like equals than it is more like a authority and a client and someone that you like. I think that's really important. Like if you don't like your therapist, you're not really going to want to tell them the deepest, darkest thoughts about yourself.
Yeah. For me, I found that the people that I choose to continue with are ones that somewhat challenge me, right? Like if you sit there and you go to a therapist and you're talking about all these people you can't stand in your life, or people that you have toxic relationships with, and they just keep verifying, they agree with you and they're like, yeah, that person's horrible. That's not helpful. You could do that with your girlfriends or your guy friends. Like I have found that it's really helpful when somebody takes an actual issue and kind of turns it and says, let's look at it from a different angle and let's like figure out how you're going to attack this, as opposed to just shitting on this, person in the air for an hour. Do you know what I'm saying?
I do, yeah, and the term we use in sort of the therapy side is collusion, right? So
Mm.
if you collude with your client or you collude with your therapist, it is this sort of endless cycle of yes, and isn't that terrible, and that sounds really bad. But you make a really good point, Rachel, which is that's fine, and that can only take you so far in the
Mm.
work. But if it keeps happening, if there is what Freud calls the repetition compulsion, where we find ourselves in the same relationships, making the same choices, or finding ourselves in the same dilemmas, the thing we have to look at there is ourselves.
Right.
And if your therapist isn't going to help you do that, then, as I'm sure you probably did in your experience, go and find somebody else. Because I do a bit of teaching, I look after other therapists as a supervisor. And one of the things I always say to therapists is, are we trying to be nice here, or are we trying to be therapeutic? And they are not always the same thing.
Yeah. And it's funny, I learned early on in my life because I would see a therapist and then I would actually travel by myself. And I kind of learned through all of this that I'm the common denominator. So I better like being alone with myself and I better like being alone with my thoughts. And so that was very helpful. And I learned that also in therapy that like I have to deal with me. I can't keep, I can't blame others or all these external things. And I think therapy is very helpful, is the bottom line. But I want to get to why I chased you around the world to find you. I read an amazing article in Vogue, which was picked up by other sources about the ick, which I think is so amazing because I've never thought of the ick as like a scientific thing or something that doctors talk about, but I think we've all experienced. So before I get into what I think it is, can you kind of explain what the ick is?
Sure, yeah. So it's we may have encountered it online, but a sort of clear definition of it really is it's a sudden revulsion or repulsion to another person, typically a person who we are either attracted to or in the really early stages of forming a relationship with. So most of the time it's romantic when we think about it, but it can be professional environments, friendship environments, even family environments. We can have this sudden revulsion, almost like a disgust response about anything from someone wearing odd socks to how they chew to maybe baby talk to an animal. Like it can be anything, but the really defining characteristic of the ick is it's very, very sudden and it really changes how we think about the person sat in front of
Right.
us.
So why can such a sudden thing like, like you said, all those examples are perfect ones where I think in Vogue they used it something as simple as somebody like leaping over a puddle sometimes gives somebody the ick. I definitely have felt it and it comes out of nowhere. And why can such a small thing all of a sudden change your mindset?
It's a great question. And there's sort of three ways we can think about it and why it happens. So the first is sort of evolutionary, right? So humans developed a disgust response to prevent us from eating bad things or going into spaces that smell odd or even things like infections or cuts and bruises, right? We are revolted by them, so it's designed to stay away from them.
Right.
That's part of it. The second one is sort of more subtle, which is about projection and bias. So, what often happens, and when I see with my clients who bring it into the room, is an ick can often be something we find disgusting in ourselves. And when
Mm,
it turns up in somebody else, we have this very instant revulsion to it. And the third and more sort of subtle part of it is really about attachment styles. So, what we see, or what I see a lot in my practice, is people who have quite a fear of intimacy, want relationships, but don't really know how to go beyond the sort of the early days, the early weeks, and use the ick as a reason why they can't go on, a reason why they can't deepen a relationship. So it's a sort of form of defense in that way. So
right.
in summary, it's sort of it's not a precise understanding, but it tends to come from those three kind of areas.
Okay, I want to talk about the second thing that you brought up. So you were talked about whether or not it's really about the other person and it's something that we are projecting. But let's talk about that for a minute. If you are grossed out or get an ick from the way somebody is on a date with you and holds their fork, or when, like you said, all of a sudden they are reading off a menu and they use a word that's in French and they don't speak French or whatever, they do this weird accent. How is that a projection of you or something you don't like about yourself?
Well, yeah, it's great questions. Let's take the example of someone trying to play off the idea that they can speak French when they clearly can't.
Right.
If we sort of
Like
zoom
if
back,
the word is, oh, I'll order the Chateaubriand, and they say something different and they screw up the word.
so screw out the word. So in that instance, if we zoom out and look at what that is someone attempting and failing to do something that we think is very easy, right?
Okay.
So in that example, what that could be a trigger of is in our own lives, the idea of looking stupid or silly is a absolute no-no, right? And we guard and defense against it, and we might do all these kinds of rituals and stuff before social situations to prevent us from ever looking that way. So someone doing it and maybe not having the right reaction to them doing it. So if they mess up Chateaubriand, if they don't own it, that little gap that's left for us to interpret how they perceive it can be about us and our own sense of like being humiliated or being stupid, right? So if we think about what would we do if we did something stupid, we might rush in to correct it, or we might rush in to beat someone to a punchline by saying, oh, we look stupid, don't worry, I already know. If the other person doesn't do that, that might be what that's about. Like,
Right.
why aren't you rushing in to tell everyone
Right.
how terrible you
That's
are?
so true. I never thought of it that way. That's so, I went out with somebody once who we were order. So whatever he said, he's like, oh, I want to order this, and I'll take the mozzarella and the ricotta. And I'm like, I was waiting for him to be like, I'm just kidding, or do you love my accent? Because I thought he was being funny and he wasn't. And then a couple other times he would repeat it. And I was like, I can't ever date this person. It was so
Right.
stupid. And you see Seinfeld episodes made from this, like the person that has the big hands or the close talker or whatever. And it's funny when you talk about it, but it could ruin your relationship.
Absolutely. And I think to your point there, like you sort of drill down a bit more into it. It's about social cues.
Mm,
If we feel discomfort at something, we're waiting for the other person to just go, I was just messing around, or that was a bit odd, wasn't it? Like to sort of own the cue.
right.
If we don't, we're left with this kind of like, was that was that a joke? Were they trying to be serious? And
Right.
that discomfort also like can bring forward the ick. And to your point about it turning up in TV, we've kind of seen it in literature going back hundreds of years. Like in actually Greek mythology, there are stories of relationships ending not by betrayal or something dramatic, but actually by a sudden loss of desire. I mean, we
Right.
see it in English literature. I think it's Pride and Prejudice. The main character suddenly stops being attracted to a suitor because of how he behaves. And Ally McBeal, I think, was the first time it was talked about in TV in 1998. And so we've always sort of known it's a thing that we have, but it didn't become this sort of cultural phenomenon until 2017, and a British reality TV star named Olivia Attwood first started using it on TV, and it just gained momentum, and the internet helped propelled it to places far beyond my shores, to America and elsewhere, and it became more of a kind of cultural phenomenon that we now are talking about.
Right. So one of the other 3 points you made, well, something you had written about in the Vogue
Rachel,
article. Yeah.
I gotta hop in here. Are they drilling in the other
In
room?
my house? No.
Next door, my neighbours, I think, are doing something. I did mention it to them. If it's problematic, George, I can say a bit again. If we lose the audio there.
It would be good just to go back and just cover that part. Like we could still hear you. I just wanted to make sure that we were all set before we continue.
Okay. Just that last part about, I guess you were talking about Pride and Prejudice into the rest. Right?
Correct. Yep.
George, is that okay?
Yep. We could start from there. Alrighty. Count you in from 3, 2.
So we've known about the ick for a really long time. It was in Greek mythology. Relationships were ending because of a sudden loss of desire. We saw it in Pride and Prejudice, which is hundreds of years old. And even in TV in the 90s and early 2000s, we saw episodes of Ally McBeal and even Carrie Bradshaw in Sex and the City talk about a sudden loss of desire. So we've always known it's there. The ick as we know it today really emerged in 2017 when a British reality TV star named Olivia Attwood first coined it as the ick, and the internet has done the rest, and years later we now see it everywhere.